And it is my utter delight to introduce Dr. Robin Jensen, the Patrick O'Brien Professor of Theology at Notre Dame. Those of you familiar already with Dr. Jensen's work are aware that she has done as much or more than any other scholar in religion to convince us that art does, in fact, seek understanding, as well as embody it, express it, provoke it, illuminate it, vivify it, prepare for it, and lead to it. I could go on. I have a lot of verbs. I've known of Dr. Jensen's complex and compelling scholarship through the library of books she has written and edited, including her magisterial work, The Cross, History, Art, and Controversy, for sale here at this conference on the third floor of the Sub, as well as Living Water, The Art and Architecture of Early Christianity, and Understanding Early Christian Art. These are just three of her, by my count, 10 books that range from high scholarly books to texts you could assign to undergraduates in classrooms. And she's not slowing down. She has 3 more under contract, and the book that I have been looking forward to for a while, I've just learned, is now out as of last month. It's called From Idols to Icons, The Evolution of Early Christian Art. So this is basically the information that I did know about Dr. Jensen. And what I didn't know until I began looking around is that she herself has a background in art, having graduated once upon a time from Parsons School of Design. And now that I look back over her impressive corpus, I wonder about how her perspective as a trained artist also informs her scholarship. So she's apparently an artist. She's definitely a scholar. And she has also been for some time what most of us are just learning to be in the academy, an investigator on major grants. Dr. Jensen has over the years brought in over $1 million in grants, and they're for cool projects too. Her most recent one looks at how different types of sacred art placed in different sites leads to different types of affective engagement with it. And this is information that will actually be used in the construction of a new chapel on Notre Dame's campus. I could go on rhapsodizing about Dr. Jensen, but I know that you're not here for my introduction. You're here for the woman herself. So please join me in offering a warm welcome for the one and only Dr. Robin Jensen.
That was a long walk. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for this time. And I'm not going to make this a really long lecture. I know it's late at night, and you've been wonderfully patient. It's wonderful to be among you. So I'm just going to dive right in. And I hope that I have all okay. So, art historians, and I count myself as one, also I count myself as a theologian, which complicates my life, but art historians attend to objects. They study how they were made and their materials and the style and the techniques of which they were made. They also attend to objects' histories, from production through a chain of different owners and contexts. As an historian who works with material remains, I like to say that my research is grounded insofar as I focus on things first and theories second. The object has always been my starting point. Art historians also attend to artists and artisans. They discern workshops and distinctive styles and, again, techniques. But because most of my artists are not uniquely talented individuals whose names I can identify, I work with early Christian art, so I don't know who they are. I depend on the research of specialists who categorize and date objects according to formal elements of composition, material, and craft. And these are important matters. Now, however, I have found myself taking what I call a 180-degree turn, away from studying objects to studying viewers, and the viewers and the viewing of objects. For the past 2 years, and now for the next 3, I have been and will be involved in a project that attempts to learn more about how people see, understand, and derive meaning from their engagement with different kinds of art objects. in this case, specifically sacred art objects, and simply my focus is on the activity, looking at art, rather than on the art as such. So there's some viewers looking at art. My initial idea for a project arose from questions I had about what might affect a viewer's experience of art. For example, how do changes in the contextual, temporal, and personal circumstances influence someone's encounter with a work of art, and how might those changes enhance or detract from their perception and meaning-making? My obvious challenge is that you can never really know what someone else sees at any given moment. The most you can know is what they choose to tell you. This challenge is much larger for an historian of ancient Christian art. My viewers are long gone, and so cannot tell me anything about what they saw or how the encounter affected them. So now my question is whether or what modern neuroscience or experimental psychology can contribute to our understanding of how ancient viewers would have encountered and were affected by the artworks in various contexts and their various personal and historical circumstances. Nevertheless, I might surmise a few things about the context of their viewing and consider the potential relevance of certain historical circumstances and religious background. So here are some ancient viewers, just to give you something to look at. My current project, at least, works with living subjects. But even in this instance, if I only have what they tell me about their viewing experience, what I will learn will be filtered by what they are willing to share, as well as by the questions I ask and how I edit and record their answers. Getting objective data, objective measurements about how viewers encounter works of art, therefore probably has to call upon empirical tools, perhaps draw upon the work of scientists who specialize in visual perception or visual cognition. So I'm going to begin by just quickly introducing my current project and then turn to how or whether I can apply what I've learned from this to questions about how ancient viewers might have responded to works of art. So this is a Templeton project funded, we were just heard about, and some of us in this room also have this project, ours is called, it's too long a title, I'm really sorry about this, The Impact of Sacred Art on Individual Memory, Spiritual Experience, and Religious Understanding. So back in pre-pandemic 2019, I responded to a call from the Templeton Research Trust under the rubric Art Seeking Understanding, the same theme as this conference. As I mentioned, my initial interest in the project was piqued because for some time I have wondered what is lost, gained, or simply changed when a work of sacred art moves from one context to another. For example, does a statue of the Madonna and Child, I'm in a Roman Catholic world, so I'm sorry, but does a statue of the Madonna and Child generate a different kind of response from a viewer when it moves from a chapel or a church to a museum? Would a sacred work in a secular context be likely to prompt a less devotionally engaged response than if it remained within a liturgical setting where it would prompt direct prayer? Consider, would a museum visitor be likely to kneel and pray before a statue of the Madonna? Would you be allowed to kiss an icon if it's in a museum? Clearly not. We can all imagine the social and perhaps even legal consequences of that, but it seems to me that this should be possible, even if I don't expect ever to see somebody doing it. In short, if an object is regarded more as an artwork than as a holy icon, is it less likely to be an aid to pious meditation and more as something to be appreciated or evaluated on purely aesthetic, stylistic, and historical grounds? Or does that just depend on the viewer's disposition? Well, I found this in the Worcester Museum of Art from 2016, and it was an interesting study. And so quickly, I'm going to just read this to you. The next time you are in a museum, check out the kneeling bench, now on display in the 14th and 15th century gallery. Part of the ongoing experiment with seating, this kneeling bench offers a way to experience the spiritual dimension of art in this gallery. The kneeling bench was loaned to the museum by the United Congregational Church, UCC, and it dates from the early 20th century and was used by couples kneeling for a blessing at the end of their wedding ceremony. I wonder what the church is doing without their kneeling bench. The kneeler is similar to a traditional prie-dieu, which is used for personal prayer and devotions. We invite you to try the kneeler yourself to experience how viewers and worshipers in centuries past might have experienced this powerful art. Interesting. I can tell you that there are kneeling benches in churches around statues that I know of, but not in museums so far as I know. So I thought this was an interesting experiment and would be worth developing into a research project. However, because the Trust's guidelines specified that the application should include procedures for producing empirically demonstrable connections between art and understanding, I realized I needed help. So in order to incorporate a scientific dimension to my research, I invited 2 psychologists to be my co-PIs. We were awarded an initial 2-year grant and began to lay out methods and design our experimental protocols. One of my 2 colleagues, Gabriel Vedvansky, specializes in memory and cognition studies to discern how people create, organize, store, and retrieve information. For this project, he examines what subjects recall immediately after viewing an art object and then a week later, and then he records the viewer's self-reported emotional engagement with the works. My other psych colleague, Jim Brockmull, uses more objective methods, including eye-tracking tools to measure the action, duration, focus, and intensity of a viewer's engagement with different types of objects. There's one of our students. My contribution will be to interpret the resulting data and glean results from the experiments from the perspective of a theologian and art historian. We are figuring out how to collaborate with one another, the sciences and the humanities, the hard with the soft sciences. It's not always easy. We speak in different languages. I still don't understand Qualtrics or Psychopie, and they don't know much about art or theology. I was laughing earlier, I had to explain Lent to them the other day. It was quite interesting. Nevertheless, working together, our basic approach is to put viewers into both real-life and fabricated encounters with selected artworks. In the first round, we identified 2 very different series of Stations of the Cross. Inside our elaborate 19th century Gothic Revival basilica is a set of these stations by the artist Luigi Gregory. Now, if you know what Stations of the Cross are, I suspect most of you do, but not everybody necessarily. This is a pilgrimage through a number of images during Passion, the Passion of Christ, which is associated with prayers and devotional readings. And usually it's something that people will especially engage in during the Holy Week. So these are very traditional, representational, 1880s styled, very large Stations of the Cross, and these are just 3 of them. The other was an outdoor, non-representative 21st century set of stations in our sculpture park by the sculptor Philip Rickey. And this is what I'm going to show you 3 of these. You tell what that is? That's the crucifixion. So they're sort of representational and sort of not. The team tried to assess encounters between the non-figurative and the very pictorial or narrative images. The dramatic contrast in the work sites also lets us attend to the different types of environments: church, garden, indoor, outdoor. We also noted the impact of times and seasons, both calendrical and liturgical. Fall, winter, spring, Lent, finals week, whatever. Before we began, we asked the subjects how they responded to the works. Before we asked them how they responded to the works, we gathered some basic background data. their age, their gender, their religious affiliation, the level of their education, college major, etc. Then we recorded their self-reported responses to the works. However, because of the difficulty with physically moving valuable objects and the added problem of social distancing during the pandemic, we had to revise our protocols, and we had to digitally manipulated the works backgrounds and doing our eye tracking studies using virtual rather than real encounters with art. We recontextualized the photographs of the objects and projected the images onto diverse and sometimes jarring settings, like a casino or a football stadium. Honestly, this felt artificial, and we didn't think it worked. At least not terribly well. Measuring how people's eyes moved over an image on a screen was not the same as observing how they would encounter actual artworks in a church or museum or football stadium or casino. But for some reason, the Templeton folks trusted us enough to let us go another round, and so our 3-year project phase expands this experiment in some key respects. We have 3 experimental studies running at the same time. 1, how does a change of context affect the viewer's experience? 2, what is the impact of the content? Is it sacred or secular? And 3, how much does style affect the matter? Representational versus non-representational works. So then we needed to attend to 3 other basic issues. First, where? Rather than simply superimposing photographs of artworks on incongruous spaces, we will now use virtual technology to simulate different environments. Equipped with headsets and handheld devices, subjects will enter and walk around in a virtual chapel, or a virtual art gallery, or a virtual warehouse. And these are really kind of just, we're still building these things. Each site will be stocked with 16 carefully selected artworks in curated pairs, both sacred and secular, and on a spectrum from representational to abstract. These spaces will be augmented with background sounds, choir practice, backup chirps of a front loader, chatter of museum gallery goers, and populated with avatars who will move around and interact with one another. So this is the warehouse, that's the chapel, and that's the art museum as it is right now. It looks pretty bare, I know, but that's what we got. Additionally, in order to manipulate temporal and event conditions, as well as the work's spatial locations, we will upload images on iPads and ask students to view them in different contexts: their dorm room, the chapel, the gallery, a classroom, the dining hall. We realize, though, have not quite resolved ways to track the issue that while where an object is viewed matters, spaces are never neutral or static. There's no blank white box. Viewers are influenced by everything that goes on around them. Let's say the museum is filled with visiting elementary school children, or it's the day after Christmas, or the room is too cold, or it's too hot. Such things affect someone's viewing experience, even from one day to the next. Thus, controlled virtual environments that we're constructing may not actually be able to replicate that aspect of viewing. It may be able to control for other things, but it doesn't really help us with that unknowable piece. But in addition to the where is the question of what. Our selected sacred objects are largely those that are presumably familiar religious subjects, like the Madonna and Child, or in that case of non-representational works, ones that have titles that prompt viewers to assume that they do. So here's a couple. This is a pair that we're going to put into the virtual museum. Okay, so this is one example. Here's another one. In order to establish some control, then, we will use these we will also use paired non-religious subjects, both representational and abstract, and these too will be given typical museum labels to identify their subjects to viewers and give them a slight prompt in case they were totally at sea. I think I have another instance of this pairing of religious subject matter, and here's a secular example paired with this one. Selecting the artworks created some real problems for us. We had to define what we meant by sacred versus secular. We were not sure if that had to do with the work's subject matter. Were we limited to biblical narratives or characters, or was that too entirely artificial? Obviously, some viewers will deem one image sacred that others will not. And what do we mean by non-representational? Many of our selected artworks were still pretty representational insofar as they had discernible figures, even if they were abstracted. The psychologists worried less about this than the art historian. They argued the disparities between the pictorial works and those that were completely non-figurative were too extreme to give us useful or meaningful measurements. If it was too abstract, they didn't want to use it. They had to have something to cling to. I'm not entirely sure I agree or understand, but I trust the reasoning. Along the same lines, how significant are judgments of aesthetic quality? What do we even mean by that? Should we select only examples of fine art? Obviously, that question is loaded with cultural baggage. The problem also that we have of resizing. If we try to digitally produce these images and make them the same size so they relate to each other, we're really artificially manipulating the actual works. And then what is beautiful? And what is ugly? What is great art? What is good art? What is bad art? The spectrum here runs the gamut from matters of individual taste, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like, to socially informed attitudes, this is Eurocentric, to external judgments of subject matter, this is not historically accurate, to deeply held theological principles. This is an icon, that's a heresy. Do we need to avoid potentially controversial images when their responses might overly skew our results? The third issue is who are the viewers, and where, and what? To consider the subject's religious affiliation, educational background, and cultivated art knowledge and appreciation, in other words, the whole person, we hope to account for fluctuating self-described attitudes and observable levels of attention. Nevertheless, we know all these issues, the background, the religious identity, etc., all contribute to and condition one's viewing experience. It's just common sense to assume that someone who is unfamiliar with accounts of Christ's passion will have a different response to depictions of it than somebody who knows the story well or hears it read out in church during Passion Week. And we all know more and more that our students don't know their Bible stories. So we can't assume anything sometimes. Or, as another example, a conservative Protestant who has been brought up to believe that religious statuary might be idolatrous likely will have a different reaction than a Roman Catholic who has grown up with saint statues in churches. In addition to the subject's general knowledge and religious backgrounds, we are also aware of what we call the docent effect. Visitors to art museums wearing headsets or reading from guidebooks are influenced by those prepared and pre-digested descriptions of works of art they gaze upon. In a good way, this fills in the gaps of a viewer's knowledge and offers basic training in visual analysis or simply art appreciation, form, color, style, content, material technique, and so forth. The problem is that once someone has listened to the short recording or read the labels, the viewing experience is no longer unconditioned or unmediated. So, now, let me turn to my project. So I hope to apply some of our study's core questions and findings to an analysis of how ancient viewers saw art and what they might have made of it. I begin by assuming that back then, just as now, a lot depends on who the viewers are, where and when they are encountering the artwork, and what they look at. Obviously, I cannot observe long-dead viewers encountering sacred artworks or interrogate them about how they respond, so this is necessarily a hypothetical experiment rather than a study based on data gleaned from observable and measurable encounters. Yet, I optimistically trust that I am learning something through these studies that will help me think about, in some new ways, about how visual art might have been perceived and understood in other times and places, or for my work, specifically 3rd and 4th century Christians living around Rome. Now here, I will reverse the order a bit and start with the viewer, the who question, and then I will consider the viewer's physical and social environments, the where and the when questions, and finally turn to the object, the what question. Collecting the data at this long historical distance is obviously really tricky. Apart from a limited body of ekphrastic literature, which rarely describes actual artworks, ancient Christian viewers in particular, left few direct reports about what they saw, how they interpreted it, and whether it conformed to or diverged from their expectations. One very rare example comes from the Cappadocian theologian Father Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, in which he describes a portrayal of Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. Many times I have seen this tragic event depicted in pictures, and I could not pass by the sight without shedding tears. So clearly and evidently did the art present it to my eyes. Isaac, kneeling, his arms behind his back, faces his father next to the altar. The father, standing behind him, grasps the son's hair with his left hand and brings it to himself and stoops over the face that looks with such pity up at him with the right hand while he points that deadly sword. Already the point of the sword touches the boy's body when a divine voice sounds forth to prohibit the act. I have to tell you, I was really surprised when I read this the first time. It really pretty much conforms to depictions of Abraham offering Isaac in early Christian art. But given the lack of other direct reports like this, I have to propose some kind of thought experiment. For the sake of time, now, I will limit my context and objects to 3rd and 4th century murals from the environments of Rome, in particular the paintings that decorated the walls and ceilings of Christian catacomb chambers. Here we are. First, who were the viewers? I really do believe, a fairly mixed, heterogeneous community composed both of elite, literate, and less elite members, possibly also of different religious identities, not necessarily all Christians. I do not believe that non-elites, the unlettered, the uneducated, or women, for example, were more drawn to pictorial art than any others, though some people have. Similarly, while some level of personal affluence was necessary to commission a decorated tomb, or even more, an ornately carved sarcophagus, no reason exists to assume that the wealthy necessarily had any more access to these objects or images after they were produced. Now, while catacomb paintings were probably viewed only occasionally on anniversaries of death or widely observed feasts of the dead, visitors, viewers, would likely include household servants and freed clients, as well as family members and close friends. And therefore, I imagine this varied group of spectators from a range of economic circumstances and social classes, and even for art that would have been commissioned by elite patrons. Presumably, these varied individuals would not have all seen the same thing at the same time, however. Then, as now, viewers differ in the kind and extent of attention they give to an object. Moreover, they come with different expectations, and these expectations influence what they attend to and how they interpret it. Mixed viewers certainly had mixed responses. But in any case, these works were almost certainly privately commissioned, and insofar as they were not in public places, probably not subject to significant supervision or control by church authorities. Yet, the chosen subject matter, coming to this in a moment, especially that made for a sepulchral or burial context, must have been, at least at some level, acceptable to the general community as well as to the owners. So what is the context? Where and when did the viewers encounter these works? Most of our surviving early Christian artworks were originally made for funerary contexts and settings. This sepulchral environment had to have influenced the viewing experience. The viewers, I imagine, were not attending liturgies in churches or art connoisseurs visiting galleries. First cautionary note. Most of the time, when we look at these images, we see them out of context, in books, projected on screens, or detached from their original settings and hung on museum walls. In order for me to study viewers and not just objects, I will need either to enter the original space itself or at least to actively imagine myself doing that. Now, assuming our viewers were mostly occasional visitors to tombs of friends or relatives or patrons, and that these visits were most likely made on special occasions, means that there were likely other people in the space, engaged in various ritual activities, including participating in memorial meals, possibly offering prayers. And here's a typical painting of such a memorial meal on the wall of a tomb, I think probably reproducing something that might have been happening at the time. Something that Yash Elsner speaks about, and I think very helpfully, as ritual conditioned viewing. We also can consider certain discernible environmental conditions. First, the spaces were tight and accessed by a complicated, multi-level network of dark and dank underground corridors. If anybody's been in the catacombs, you know how dark and dank and claustrophobic they are. Simply finding one's way around could be disorienting and even frightening. Second, the chambers of these catacombs that had the most artworks were quite small. They still are. Viewers would see the works up close. Both the ceilings and walls were decorated. Walls can be seen straight on, but ceilings require turning one's eyes and head upwards, which will totally skew the viewing experience. And this is an instance of a group of students visiting a catacomb as Domitila. Third, these chambers had to be lit by torches and oil lamps. Light wells existed, but only for the galleries and not for the burial chambers. So even though in a tight space, a viewer might not be able to see a whole program at one glance, but only by turning around. So what did they see? They would have seen more than one image. Even though darkness would have prevented seeing everything at once, individual paintings were related to adjacent others, even if they were made at different times, so not necessarily intended to be viewed simultaneously. The tight spaces meant that they were an integrated programmatic group. Thus, we can assume some degree of perceived, if not intended, structure and organization to the cycle of images on the walls. Well, what were they? The dominant subject matter of most of our early survivings of Christian art refer to specific textual, biblical sources, although a number also depict subjects that might be religiously ambiguous, merely decorative, or perhaps purely secular. The most popular subjects were based on stories from the Christian Old Testament, Noah and Jonah and Abraham and Isaac and Moses and Susanna. These were followed by depictions of Jesus working miracles, multiplying loaves and fish, healing the sick and the disabled, and healing the woman with the hemorrhage and the paralytic. What's missing, what's not there, are any depictions of Christ's death on the cross, the Last Supper, the empty tomb, or the Ascension. These subjects do not appear until the 5th and even the 6th century. Moreover, these are narrative scenes, but they're not illustrations. They only allude to the certain stories in brief and schematic ways. As such, I venture to say they were intended to prompt recollection not of the stories, but of the ways these stories were interpreted in light of Christian beliefs as expressed in textual sources, rituals, homilies, hymns, and prayers, and commentaries. Given the context of the tomb, I suspect they relate especially to Christian beliefs about the promised afterlife and the resurrection of the faithful believer at the end of time. So here, what we see in these two slides, you can see here's Daniel, and Daniel is very prominent in many Christian. And Daniel in this the image it's on my left, is Daniel naked. And why is Daniel naked? That's the first question one of my students asked me 20 years ago. And I've been thinking about that ever since. Why is Daniel always naked? And I have an answer for that, but it would take us another lecture. Noah is shown, he's upside down on the top of that image, but you can see he's in a little box. He doesn't have any animals. He doesn't have his wife or his sons or his daughters-in-law at all. He's just a guy in a box with a bird. So, you don't have much to go on with this. You have to already know what you're looking at, and it's already been interpreted for you. This is visual exegesis happening here. Jonah is very popular. Jonah is shown in sequential scenes, but he's also always naked. Here he is. I can probably use the mouse to show you. So here he is getting thrown up from the mouth of the sea monster, and here he is reclining under his gourd vine, and over here he's actually being swallowed by the sea monster. That's this little rear end going into the mouth of the monster. So we have these naked figures, and so we have to think why they're naked, and I think it has everything, my sense, it's a long story, it has everything to do with baptism in part. Over here we have Moses striking the rock, but there's the healing of the paralytic, and there's Noah again in his box, and this is the woman with the hemorrhage being healed. So these are very short, very abbreviated images. And they're not illustrating stories. They're telling us stories. Okay. Because these are abbreviated, almost emblematic scenes from their source narratives rather than full or detailed illustrations, we recognize that they presume some knowledge, not only of the scriptures on which they were based, but some means of distinguishing them, aka the docent effect. But they do not simply point back to these biblical narratives, as I've just said. As in early Christian homilies and commentaries on the stories from which they draw, they point symbolically and typologically beyond themselves to Christian teachings about Christ and the church. They are, in this way, interpretations or exegeses. A person who's been instructed, even only by church liturgies and sermons, will remember these connections as well as the initial stories. And here I propose that the selection of narrative images is relevant to the setting. This is all important. In this case, it's a burial chamber. And this reflects the ways these stories reinforce teachings about human mortality and the afterlife. We have nothing to compare, I'll just say this, with churches at the time. All we have is funerary art. What it would have looked like if they'd painted the walls of the churches in Rome, we don't know. But I think we have to keep in mind that we have a particular kind of setting here. So taken together, let me propose a hypothetical viewer who has some general knowledge of her Bible stories, but has also been prompted to recognize the more than literal sense of these images. So my imaginary early Christian viewer enters a semi-dark tomb space. Oh, here's another example. And perceives a series of images. Now, I'm going to play a little game with you, and we're getting close to the end, but I want to do this one thing. I want to walk us through this very famous chamber in the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome, called the Chamber of the Velatio, because of this veiled woman. And this is what you're going to see. Now, fortunately, somebody did this for me. I can take you a minute through this. You're entering now this catacomb chamber in the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome. And just be the viewer, just be the one who's experiencing this. Put yourself into the scene. You go around the corner now, and you enter the chamber. And now we're leaving again. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through just these images, and then we're going to just draw this to a close. But this is the first thing you see when you come in, and you see this figure of this praying woman who's probably meant to be the deceased who's buried here. So this is her portrait. Maybe she's your mother. Maybe she's your best friend. And here we are visiting her in her tomb and celebrate her life with a meal. To the right and to the left of this image of her, and she's got a wonderful face. That's a good detail on this. You can see how lively that painting is, even as old as it is. And it's not a wonderful piece of art, but it has a lot of vivid life in it. Are probably the same woman, and possibly her husband with her 2 children on one side, and on the other side, possibly the same woman holding a baby. There's different theories about who these 3 figures on the left might be. Above her is a peacock, and to either sides are birds. I'll give you a little bit of a detail on that. Some people think that the image on the left may be the woman herself receiving her bridal veil and also her bridal contract. But that's kind of hard to sort of resolve with the other 2 figures, so I'm not quite sure. On the left, and I'll go back a little bit so you can see where I am. Here's where we are. If we look over to this side, we see this figure. So turn your heads and look over to this side, and we see, what do we see here? We see actually Abraham and Isaac. Abraham pointing to the flaming altar, and Isaac carrying a little bundle of wood and looking up at his father. On the other side are the 3 youths in the fiery furnace. So what are we thinking as we're seeing these images? We see the woman praying for deliverance from death, her family around her, Abraham and Isaac being delivered, the 3 youths from the fiery furnace. That's probably the 4th figure that looks a little like an odd bird flying in here, being delivered also from death. Overhead is the Good Shepherd. All right, this is kind of borrowed from, I should have done a better job with this image, but I wanted to share a couple texts that were really, might have been something like the hypothetical viewer would have seen. The Good Shepherd died for our sake, that he might take us out of the dark pit of death and prepare to enfold us among the companies of heaven and give unto us mansions above, even with the Father, instead of dens situated in the depths of the abyss or the recesses of the sea. Which is why he says, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And the thing directly overhead as you first walk into this tomb is this figure of Jonah being cast out of the mouth of the sea creature. And I shared this from Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father, who says, from the beginning, God permitted humanity to be swallowed up by the great sea creature, who was the author of transgression, not so that humanity should perish altogether when so engulfed, but God arranged and prepared the plan of salvation, which was accomplished by the word through the sign of Jonah. This was done so that when humanity, receiving an unhoped for salvation from God, might rise from the dead and glorify God and repeat the word which was uttered in the prophecy by Jonah. I cried by reason of mine affliction to my God, and God heard me out of the belly of hell. I'm just thinking this is not the exact words that would be on the mind of this our hypothetical viewer entering this tomb, but could something be very similar to that. So it's all related to death and deliverance from death, and also trust and faith in the resurrection. Jonah, of course, is never shown except as resurrected and peacefully lying under his gourd vine, naked. So, tentative conclusion. What can I surmise about what ancient viewers saw and how they understood it? Well, first, is it likely that viewers were a mixed social group, not necessarily all Christians, and they would have come with different expectations, levels of instruction, and previous experiences with the artworks, just like my modern viewers. Nevertheless, the remarkable consistency of my iconographic inventory suggests that viewers had a shared visual vocabulary, one that allowed them, even encouraged them, to recognize subjects or themes, and they derived, even if they derived different meanings from them. Second, both viewers and objects occupied a specific context. No encounter with an artwork takes place in a void. For example, I assume that in the case of wall paintings on tombs, that would have prompted viewers to connect with what they saw with their religious beliefs, expectations, or hopes, in this case, about the afterlife. In other words, in the particular environment, viewers regarded the image programs as messages related to death and deliverance from death. If a certain image or program of images is translated to a different kind of space, let's say a church or a baptistry, I think the message would change. Finally, images and objects are part of larger networks of meaning. The viewing experience is affected, and that maybe I've said this over and over again already, but it's affected by a huge range of external factors beyond expectations, education, and environment. It is socially conditioned and a constructed activity. Of course, we rarely have the objects that are viewed without restorations and in their original settings. We can't use them very often for our experiments with our imagined viewers. Objects have histories and they have biographies. They get moved around and changed, and as they do, they gather new meanings. Because of all these moving parts, we have to be cautious about what any work of art would have meant to anyone in the past or the present. But nevertheless, this exercise has brought me around to thinking as much about the viewers and their encounters as about the objects they saw. I will confess, it's still a work in progress. I have much to learn from psychologists, visual cognition specialists, and even brain scientists. And I hope I can apply what I learn in a theoretical way to subjects I cannot hook up to eye-tracking devices or observe and interview. I also hope that this work will help me understand the objects themselves better, insofar as they become an integral part of a dynamic process. They are malleable things. They are not passive, permanent, or static. They too belong to a network of relationships, which means they have their own kind of agency. They are how they appear and where they appear, and this can and will change. As participants in a viewing event, they are participants in the viewing event, and they are the part of an ongoing and evolving reciprocal relationship. Recognizing this, I believe, will help a historian gain access to and a wider perspective on beliefs and lived practices of a particular community of believers. So the effort is worth it, as tenuous as it all is, to ask if what I see is what they saw, and if what I think it means could be at all the same as what they made out of it. Thank you.
About 10 minutes for questions, so our comments or conversations about the terrific talk that Professor Jensen just gave. So we got microphones. You can just raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you.
This is kind of a point for conversation. I just had an idea during the talk that I thought I would love to test against you. When you showed the image of the funerary feast, I was reminded of the iconography of Abraham, with Sarah serving and Abraham between the two men. And often when you showed images, I was reminded of different kinds of iconography. And I was thinking of some of the presentations we heard earlier, and it struck me that perhaps it almost looks like someone was illustrating, like I was reminded of being a kid and doing Christmas pageants and sitting there with a lamb, and like it kind of looks like actors with props. Do you think there's any relation to some kind of early Christian Christmas pageant?
I think it's a pageant. I think these images, and there are a lot of them, of people sitting at a table. And when I'm talking about ritual-centered viewing, I think it's really important to think of that, because I think in these spaces, rituals are taking place. And so one of the things I'm thinking about with my psychologist is how much this might channel your neuroscience, to think what it means to be looking at an image of something which is actually going on or did. So it's like a continuous ritual being presented in the space in which a ritual is taking place. So it's a little like a Christmas pageant. But I think they actually did sit around tables and dined with the dead. And so I think what we're seeing is a reproduction of something that actually happened.
quite intrigued by the depictions of biblical instances of God's deliverance. Jonah delivered from the belly of the whale. Isaac delivered. Daniel delivered. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you found, you mentioned that these paintings seem to depict what the people had learned from sermons preached
Mhm.
on those biblical stories. I'm wondering if you have found sermons that had explicated that.
Yep, I do. I have a lot of them. And so what my job has always been to try to coordinate, and this makes art historians sometimes very anxious, but I try to coordinate the sermons, the prayers, the liturgies that I can find with the images that I have, to say that they are related. They're coming from the same social context, and there's no other way to understand them. So we don't have very many descriptions of actually seeing artworks. I've got this one precious one or two, but I do think that people are trained to look at images because of what they have heard. Whether they're literate or non-literate, they're hearing sermons in churches, they're singing hymns, they're saying prayers. Yeah. And I think there's we don't have exact, but I think we have a great reason to think the prayers for the dead were particularly influential in this iconography.
This was a wonderfully fascinating subject, and I loved it a lot. I am curious, and perhaps Dr. Carnes, in her introduction, already answered this question, so I apologize if I am retreading familiar ground. Have you applied or considered applying these types of experimental techniques toward analyzing people's experiences of different worship services, like in a contemporary setting, such as someone going to Mass versus going to more of like a non-denominational worship concert atmosphere?
This experiment hasn't quite expanded to that, but I tell you, I teach a course on Christian architecture, and so I have a really strong interest in the fact that spaces and the ways that spaces are structured and decorated have everything to, people are consciously and unconsciously formed theologically by the places in which they worship. There's no question in my mind about that. And so often I try to tell my students, pay attention to that, observe where you are, notice what they're looking at. Your sermon is not going to be the one they remember. What they're going to remember was that stained glass window. It's really true. So yeah. I think it's really important. I haven't quite expanded to that, but.
One last question.
I think this is a quick question. Is there a connection between Augustine's description in the Confessions of his mother's practice of going to the graves of the dead and what you showed us on the screen?
Absolutely. and it was controversial. The bishops kept trying to make people stop doing it. So we know that they were doing it. And it's a continuation. I'll make one quick sideways, connecting dots for you. So we know that because there were complaints about, from the church authorities about people continuing to carry picnic baskets to the tombs, and then they transferred it from the tombs of their family dead to the tombs of the saints, right? So they kind of moved it over to the sacred tomb. And what we get is then the feast of the saint on the saint's feast day. And what they finally started doing is that let's move those tombs inside the churches or the relics so that we can celebrate them on the altar and get them out of the catacombs, get them out of the graveyards where they're drinking too much and they're getting too rowdy, So it was really an interesting transition, and I think this is when you begin to see, by the middle of the 4th century, miracles of relics being put in the altars so that you move that meal to the Eucharistic meal and shift it.
Please join me in